Good afternoon. It's Monday, August 5th, 2019, and this is part 2 of my explaining my 11-year saga of being a targeted individual assaulted by law enforcement and other minions of the deep state. And just to briefly summarize, I hadn't intended to do these via video. I had done a written account and posted it on Facebook, and it was disappeared and censored by Facebook. So I thought I would try YouTube, and hopefully YouTube isn't into the censorship game the way Facebook is. So just a brief summary from part 1. This all began for me as I was an entertainer in Nashville, Tennessee, in a really vulnerable part of my life. I had been working with networks internationally and nationally through my music, and I was a good communicator, a good diplomat, politically active, more towards the left end of the spectrum. And kind of in your face, I disturbed a lot of people. And so 2008, when George Bush ceded the Patriot Act to anyone in media without judicial oversight to hunt individuals with state-of-the-art military surveillance and other technologies, I became targeted. And rather than capitulate to whatever they wanted or hide like a mouse or run away, I blew the whistle. Theoretically, precisely whistleblowers work within an organization and blow the whistle from within the organization. I was not in the corporate media. I was an independent recording artist, but I made public what had been happening to me. I was a very good communicator, and so that sort of went viral all over the world. And I've been playing a cat and mouse game with the deep state ever since. And so I eventually fled from Nashville to stay with a relative in Portland, Oregon, and tried to take a stand there for 4 years, but continued to be hounded, where I fled home to Hawaii and stayed with my father for a few years. But when I started to compile memoirs of what had happened to me into a book and possibly a screenplay, the same deep state trickery started happening again, gaslighting, invasions of my private spaces, all sorts of sadistic trickery that culminated in my beginning to find these crystalline, dusty chemicals that had been seeded into my bedding, clothing, undergarments that caused terribly painful burning rashes and blisters. And I fled to the Big Island, where the deep state had a very extensive tentacles of trafficking houses that I got processed through repeatedly. I would go there and thinking the people were nice and above board, and then if I didn't act like a second wife or a love interest or a servant, I would again find these horrible toxins in my personal belongings, and then I would flee to the next house where the same thing would happen. And so the story continues now as I flee back to Oregon. And in Oregon, the situation only escalated, and I began running a gauntlet from hotel to hotel, starting in Portland all the way down the coast to Newport, where I could rarely stay more than one night at a hotel, 3 nights at the most, before the chemicals would appear in my room as I would, go out to go shopping or something. Individuals would sneak in and poison the rooms. And the chemicals became more and more toxic, and I began to become more toxic as a result. It grew more and more difficult to detox from them. These more dangerous chemicals seeped into my bones at times, my teeth and jaws, excruciating pain at the roots, and sometimes little hard nodules would form of concentrated poison, and then I would spend hours of the day just massaging them, and eventually I could get them to dissipate out into my lymph and possibly avoid mouth cancer or teeth falling out. And I developed a range of very strange symptoms. I mean, I could feel these chemicals all the way into my bones, and I developed violent allergies to polyesters and many different synthetic type of clothing. I could no longer wear undergarments because of the elastic would cause rashes and blisters. I often couldn't wear shoes. There's a stretch of time in the winter on the coast where I walked barefoot most of the time because my feet would have a violent reaction in the shoes. And also a whole range of metals I became allergic to. And so I couldn't, for instance, touch certain surfaces while riding a bus, and I had to put a few layers of cardboard under my shod feet, or my feet would erupt in painful contusions. And my phones several times got contaminated to the point that if I talked extensively on the phone, open sores would appear on my face or my skin, and blood would start running down my face. And so I took a chance and took a bus to Eugene, which sort of became my base camp for a while. And at that point, I had maxed out my credit card. My father would sporadically give me money, but it was very touch and go. And I was forced to stay in a homeless shelter there for a few months. And I just kept on getting exposed maliciously. When I was out and about in the public, I was constantly having to change my clothes or spend half an hour rinsing my upper body and hair over and over and again to rid myself of whatever I'd been exposed to. So at this point, I had developed what's called a hyperallergy, and so just even micro amounts of toxic substances would cause an extreme reaction. And to this day, if somebody has a chemical on them that I'm allergic to, I can just pivot my head, even when they're 50 yards away, and my ear passage will swell shut. There's like a little sort of glandular thing going on here. And if I am in the presence of a chemical, I become a bloodhound that way, which has probably saved me a lot of grief because I can see at a distance or sense at a distance when to avoid a person or an object that's been contaminated. And so there are crowds of private citizens that enlist themselves in this public stalking of an individual. And so when you're a targeted individual, you always have to be on your guard. There's people that always want to try to play little mind games and gaslight you when they have the chemical on them to make you seem